Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, the water is warming. And the last time it warmed this much, somewhere between 30 and 60 million people died. We are going to go back to 1877. We will watch a famine swallow 4 continents at once. We will follow the science that finally proved what caused it, and we will look at what is building right now, in 2026, as scientists issue warnings the world cannot ignore. If you find this useful, like and subscribe. We are just getting started. Prepare yourselves. We begin. The Pacific Ocean is the biggest thing on Earth. It covers more area than every continent combined. It holds more water than you can picture. And buried inside it, running along the equator, is a slow, invisible engine that controls weather across the entire planet. Most people have heard the name El Niño. Most people think it means bad storms or a weird winter. But what it actually does is something far bigger, far stranger, and far more dangerous than a rough season. Here is what is really happening. The equatorial Pacific normally runs on a pattern. Trade winds blow steadily from east to west, pushing warm surface water toward Asia and Australia. That warm water piles up on the western side of the ocean, sometimes sitting 3 feet higher than the water on the eastern side near South America. Meanwhile, on the eastern side, cold, deep water rises up to replace the warm water that got pushed away. The eastern Pacific stays cool, the western Pacific stays warm. That is the system in balance. Then something shifts. Scientists still debate exactly what triggers it. The trade winds weaken, maybe they stutter, maybe they slow. Whatever the cause, the effect is immediate. Without the winds pushing it west, that mountain of warm water starts sliding back east, across thousands of miles of open ocean, like water tilting in a bathtub. The eastern Pacific heats up fast, the western Pacific cools, and the entire atmosphere above the ocean reorganizes itself to match. That reorganization is El Niño. When the warm water moves east, the thunderstorms that feed on that heat move with it. Rainfall patterns shift. Monsoons weaken or strengthen in the wrong places. Drought hits where there should be rain. Floods hit where there should be dry season. And this does not stay local. The tropical atmosphere acts like a conveyor belt, shipping the effects of that Pacific shift to India, Africa, Brazil, Australia, and even North America. A single ocean, a single pattern shift, and the entire planet feels it within months. Picture a row of dominoes stretching from the Pacific all the way to a wheat field in India. The first domino is the trade wind slowing down. The last domino is a farmer watching his crop die. El Niño is the force that tips the first one. Now here is what makes scientists pay close attention right now. El Niño events range from weak to moderate to strong. Most years, a weak event comes and goes, and most people never notice. A moderate event produces drought in some places, and floods in others, causes some economic damage, and fades. A strong event can reshape global weather for over a year, crash food production across multiple continents, and kill people by the millions. And then there is the rare category above strong. Researchers use the term super El Niño informally, usually for events where the Pacific warms more than 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, above the long-term average in the key monitoring zone. That extra heat means extra energy, extra moisture, extra disruption. The difference between a strong event and a super event can mean the difference between a bad harvest and a collapse. The last time the Pacific crossed that threshold was 2015 to 2016. The event before that was 1997 to 98, and the one before that, in 1877, killed tens of millions. In May of 2026, scientists issued a warning: the Pacific is warming again. And what that warming can do to a single harvest, to a single country, to a single year's food supply, is something the next chapter will show you up close. Stand at the equator and hold your hand out. You would feel a steady wind pushing against your palm, blowing from east to west. It has been blowing that way for centuries. Ships used it to cross oceans before engines existed. Sailors called it the trade wind, and for a long time they thought it was just a convenient breeze. It is the hinge that holds the planet's weather together. The trade winds are born from temperature differences between the tropics and the poles. Warm air rises near the equator, cool air sinks at higher latitudes, and the spin of the Earth curves the whole circulation sideways. The result is a belt of steady easterly winds circling the tropical Pacific, reliable enough that for most of human history they seemed permanent. But permanent is the wrong word. These winds are strong, but they are not locked in. They respond to the ocean surface below them. When the ocean is warm, the air above it rises fast, pulling the winds in tighter. When the ocean cools, the whole circulation loosens, and when the winds weaken even slightly, the ocean responds by moving warm water east instead of keeping it piled up in the west. Scientists call this feedback loop the Bjerknes feedback, named after a Norwegian researcher who described it in 1969. The idea is simple. Warmer water in the east weakens the winds. Weaker winds let more warm water move east. More warm water warms the east further. The loop feeds itself until the entire Pacific flips into a new state. That new state is El Niño. When the trade winds collapse enough to trigger the feedback, the warm water that normally sits off Australia and Indonesia starts moving. It slides east across 4,000 miles of open ocean. That is roughly the distance from Los Angeles to London. The warm pool does not travel fast by human standards, but it carries so much heat that its arrival reshapes the entire column of air above the Pacific. Where the warm water sits, thunderstorms erupt. Massive rain clouds build up and pump energy high into the atmosphere. In a normal year, those clouds cluster near Australia and Southeast Asia. During El Niño, they cluster near the Central Pacific, closer to South America. The atmosphere notices. Jet streams shift, pressure patterns reorganize, and within weeks, weather changes in places that have nothing to do with the Pacific. India's monsoon loses its driver. Southern Africa dries out. Peru gets drenched. Australia bakes. These regions are not getting hit by Pacific storms. They are getting hit by the knock-on effects of the atmosphere reorganizing itself around a new heat source. The scale is hard to picture. Imagine the Pacific as a pot on a stove. The trade winds are the lid, keeping the heat where it belongs. When the lid shifts, steam escapes in all the wrong directions. Your kitchen fills with heat. And the kitchen, in this case, is the entire atmosphere surrounding Earth. The amount of heat stored in even the top few feet of tropical ocean dwarfs anything humans have ever generated. One researcher described the energy released during a strong El Niño as equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs going off every day, sustained for over a year. That heat does not destroy things directly. It reorganizes the atmosphere, and the atmosphere then decides where the rain falls, where the drought hits, and which harvests survive. That reorganization is almost invisible from the ground. A farmer in India or Zimbabwe has no way to see a warming patch of ocean thousands of miles away. What they see is a sky that refuses to rain. What happens when that sky goes silent over an entire continent? You are about to find out. On May 14, 2026, a team of scientists published a routine report. On the surface, it looked like a standard update. A few charts, some probability numbers, a short discussion of ocean conditions, the kind of document that climate scientists release every month, usually read by a small group of specialists, and almost nobody else. This one spread fast. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the American agency that monitors global ocean and atmosphere conditions, issued what it called an El Niño watch. The language was careful. It said El Niño was likely to emerge soon. It said there was an 82% chance of formation between May and July of 2026. It said there was a 96% chance the event would persist through the winter of 2026 into 2027. Those numbers are high by the standards of climate forecasting. An 82% probability is roughly the same confidence a doctor has when reading a clear scan. Something is happening. The system is already moving. Headlines hit immediately. Super El Niño incoming. Millions at risk. Scientists warn of global catastrophe. The coverage was loud, urgent, and in some ways ahead of what the science actually said. Because the report also included a number that most headlines left out. When the same scientists estimated the peak strength of the coming event, every single category, from weak to moderate to strong to super, had less than a 37% probability. That means the scientists were confident something was coming. They were far less confident about how bad it would get. That gap between El Niño is forming, and this will be a super event, is enormous. A weak El Niño can come and go with barely a trace. A super El Niño can reshape global food production for 2 years. The watch does tell us something real and important. Ocean temperatures in the central equatorial Pacific are rising above the long-term average. The trade winds are showing signs of weakening. The conditions that trigger the Bjerknes feedback loop are building. The atmosphere and ocean are coupling in the way they do before a significant event. Scientists compare issuing an El Niño watch to a doctor saying a patient's blood pressure is rising. It is a warning to pay attention. It is preparation time. It is the moment when food agencies, disaster managers, and governments should start planning for scenarios. But it is not a diagnosis of a heart attack. What separates a watch from a confirmed disaster is time. The months between a watch and a peak event are months when preparation can happen. Modern forecasting systems, satellite tracking, and international response networks exist precisely because the world learned, over a century of terrible events, that early warning saves lives. The 1877 event had no warning system, no satellites, no probability models, no international agency sending alerts. The people in its path had no idea what was coming until their wells ran dry. The 2026 warning exists because of everything that went wrong in the past. Understanding what went wrong in 1877 requires going back to that year, to a Pacific Ocean that was already heating up, and to a world that was completely unprepared for what a warming ocean could do to the sky above 4 continents at once. Something was already building, and no one saw it coming. Every El Niño starts the same way. The trade winds slow, the warm water slides east, the atmosphere shifts. But then the events diverge. Most stay moderate, a few grow large, and a rare handful become something that scientists remember for generations. The line between strong and super comes down to temperature. Scientists measure El Niño strength by tracking ocean surface temperatures in a stretch of the equatorial Pacific called the Niño 3.4 region, a monitoring zone sitting roughly in the middle of the ocean. When average temperatures in that zone rise more than 0.5 degrees Celsius above the long-term average and stay there, El Niño has officially formed. When they rise more than 1.5 degrees, the event is classified as strong. When they cross 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit above the historical average, researchers begin using the word super. 2 degrees does not sound dramatic. It sounds like a small number. Here is what 2 degrees of ocean warming actually means. The Pacific is not a bathtub, it is a body of water covering 70 million square miles. Warming the entire equatorial zone of that ocean by 2 degrees requires an almost unimaginable amount of heat energy. Scientists who have tried to quantify it describe it as the equivalent of every power plant on Earth running continuously for decades, just to warm that single stretch of water by that single amount. That stored heat does not stay in the ocean, it transfers into the atmosphere. Warm water evaporates faster, loading the air with moisture. That moisture fuels bigger, taller thunderstorm systems. Those systems pump energy higher into the atmosphere, and the higher that energy reaches, the farther it can travel before it disrupts weather systems thousands of miles away. A 2-degree event creates feedback effects that a 1-degree event simply cannot match. The monsoon disruptions become longer, the droughts become deeper, the floods become more violent. And critically, the timing shifts. A stronger El Niño can delay the arrival of seasonal rains not by days but by months. For a farmer waiting on those rains to plant, a month's delay can destroy an entire crop cycle. The modern examples of true super events are few. The 1982-83 event caught forecasters completely off guard. The 1997-98 event was the first tracked closely by satellites from start to finish. The 2015-16 event became the benchmark modern scientists compare everything else to. All three crossed the 2-degree threshold. All three caused catastrophic disruption across multiple continents. And all three happened in a world with far more monitoring, far faster communication, and far better emergency systems than the world of 1877. The event of 1877 crossed that same threshold and possibly exceeded it, with no monitoring stations in the tropical Pacific, no satellite imagery, no seasonal forecast models, and no international early warning system. The people who lived in its path knew nothing about ocean temperature anomalies. They knew only that the rain had stopped coming. What that silence meant for the next 2 years across India, China, Brazil, and Africa simultaneously is one of the most devastating stories in the history of Earth's climate. And it starts with the monsoon, the great seasonal rain system that more people depend on for food and water than any other weather pattern on the planet. The monsoon is next, and what El Niño did to it in 1877 changes everything. Before the world understood what a super El Niño could do, it had to live through a few of them. The first modern one hit in 1982. Scientists did not see it coming. At the time, monitoring the tropical Pacific required ocean buoys, ship reports, and weather stations scattered across remote islands. The coverage was thin, the data was slow, the models were rough by today's standards. When the trade wind started weakening in early 1982, the signal was there in the data, but no one put the full picture together in time. By late 1982, the Pacific had already crossed into super territory. Peru received devastating floods. Drought gripped Australia, southern Africa, and parts of India. Wildfires burned across Indonesia and the Americas. Coral reefs bleached across the tropical Pacific. As ocean temperatures spiked, the economic damage across the globe reached tens of billions of dollars. The event lasted about 18 months. When it ended, climate scientists had a new level of respect for what a super El Niño could do. They built better monitoring systems. They deployed more buoys. They improved their models. And they waited. 15 years later, it happened again. The 1997-98 event became the most studied El Niño in history. Satellites tracked it from birth. Ocean sensors measured its heat in real time. Scientists issued warnings months before the peak. Governments prepared. Emergency agencies stockpiled supplies. And it still caused massive damage. Peru flooded, Kenya flooded, Indonesia burned. Australia dried out. Coral across the Pacific bleached on a scale never recorded before. Over 30,000 deaths were linked to the event globally. The economic damage reached around $45 billion. And this was with modern warning systems, modern emergency response, and months of advance notice. The 1997-98 event also gave scientists their clearest data yet on how super El Niños work mechanically. They could track the warm water moving east in near real time. They could watch the trade wind collapse unfold step by step. They mapped the global chain of knock-on effects as they happened. The data from that single event filled entire research careers. Then came 2015-16. This one set records. Ocean temperatures in the Niño 3.4 region peaked around 2.5 degrees Celsius above the long-term average, among the highest values ever recorded in that zone. The event lasted about 15 months, Global average temperatures in 2016 set a new record for the warmest year in modern history, driven in part by the extra heat El Niño released into the atmosphere. Droughts hit Ethiopia, southern Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. Floods hit parts of South America. Coral bleaching events struck every major reef system on the planet, including the Great Barrier Reef, which suffered the most widespread damage in recorded history. Roughly 60 million people across the globe faced food insecurity linked to the event. Each of these three events caused massive disruption in a world with satellites, forecasters, emergency agencies, and international aid systems. The event of 1877 had none of those defenses. And it was at least as strong. What happened next in that year is a story that most people have never heard and one that every person alive today should understand. In the spring of 1877, the Pacific Ocean began to change. There were no satellites overhead, no buoys floated in the equatorial water, measuring temperature. No government agency was tracking ocean conditions. The vast machinery of the tropical Pacific, the trade winds, the warm water pool, the deep cold upwelling off South America, operated in complete silence, unobserved, unmeasured, unnamed. The people who would be destroyed by what was building had no word for El Niño. That word did not exist yet. Peruvian fishermen would later use the name after noticing a warm current that sometimes appeared near Christmas, calling it El Niño, meaning the child, a reference to the Christ child. But the science, the global scale of it, the planetary chain of consequences, none of that was understood anywhere in 1877. What was understood was hunger, and hunger was already spreading. The first signs appeared in the data that scientists would reconstruct over a century later. Ocean temperatures in the central equatorial Pacific rose sharply through late 1876 and into 1877. The warming was exceptional. Modern analysis of ice cores, tree rings, coral records, and historical documents suggests the event was among the strongest in at least the past 500 years, possibly longer. The trade winds weakened, the warm water slid east, the massive column of moist air and thunderstorms that normally sat over Southeast Asia began to migrate toward the Central Pacific, and thousands of miles away, in India, the monsoon began to fail. The Indian subcontinent depends on the summer monsoon for the vast majority of its annual rainfall. Farmers plant in expectation of the rains arriving in June. If the rains come late or fail, the planting window closes. If the window closes, the harvest fails. If the harvest fails and there is no backup system, people starve. In 1877, the rains came late, then they came too little, then they stopped. Fields that should have been green by July were cracked and pale. Wells dropped faster than anyone expected. Rivers that fed irrigation canals ran lower than anyone alive had ever seen them. Cattle began dying. The first reports of starvation reached British colonial administrators in the summer of 1877. And here is where the story splits into two disasters running at once. One disaster was the climate. The Pacific had flipped, the monsoon had broken, and a drought of exceptional severity was sweeping across southern and central India. The second disaster was the response. The system that should have protected the population did the opposite. What that colonial system did during those months, while millions of people were dying, is one of the most disturbing chapters in climate history. And it matters not just as history, but as a warning about what happens when the people holding the food make choices that have nothing to do with feeding the hungry. That story is coming, but first, the drought itself needs to be felt. Because what it looked like on the ground, what it did to the land, to the animals, to the water supply, was something that had never happened to that part of the world on that scale before. And it was happening simultaneously in 3 other regions, thousands of miles apart. India runs on rain. The country sits in a position on Earth where every summer, Warm, moist air from the Indian Ocean sweeps north and inland, dumping massive amounts of water across the subcontinent. This is the monsoon. It fills rivers, it recharges aquifers, it waters fields, and it has done this every year, with some variation, for as long as human civilization in the region has existed. Most people alive in 1877 had never seen it truly fail. The monsoon is driven by temperature differences between the ocean and the land. When summer heat warms the Indian landmass faster than the surrounding ocean, air rises over the continent and draws moisture in from the sea. The system is powerful, but it depends on the tropical atmosphere being in the right state to deliver moisture to the right places. That atmospheric state is vulnerable to the Pacific. When El Niño heats the central Pacific, it changes where the biggest thunderstorm systems on Earth are located. Those systems drive a large-scale atmospheric circulation pattern called the Walker circulation, a planetary-scale loop of rising and sinking air that connects the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. When El Niño shifts the Pacific thunderstorms east, it changes the Walker circulation, and when the Walker circulation changes, the pressure patterns over the Indian Ocean shift. The monsoon loses its normal drive. In the summer of 1877, the monsoon arrived weakened. The rains that normally fell across central and southern India from June through September came late and thin. By July, it was clear to anyone watching the sky that something was deeply wrong. By August, district administrators were sending urgent reports. By September, the harvest season had already collapsed in several provinces. The numbers researchers reconstructed are staggering. Rainfall across large parts of the Deccan Plateau, a farming region the size of several American states combined, ran at roughly half its normal level. In some districts, the shortfall was worse. Fields that needed a consistent supply of water through the growing season received a fraction of what the crops required. Crops do not respond to water shortages gradually. When a plant is deprived of water at a critical point in its growth cycle, it does not produce a smaller harvest. It produces almost nothing. The mechanism is binary at the margin. Enough water equals a crop. Too little equals failure. Across those millions of acres, the choice was made by physics. The rain did not come. The crops failed. What happened next was a cascade. Farmers who had planted on credit, expecting a harvest to repay it, had nothing. Landowners who rented land to tenant farmers lost their income and cut off what little safety net existed. Food prices spiked immediately as local supplies vanished. People who had savings bought food at inflated prices, until the savings ran out. People with no savings started going hungry within weeks of the harvest failure. The drought did not relent. The following year, the rains were again deficient across large parts of the same region. A second failed harvest compounded the first. People who had survived the first year by spending every reserve they had were now completely exposed. The land itself began to change. Without plant cover, topsoil dried and cracked. Cattle, which farmers depended on both for milk and for ploughing, began dying in large numbers. Once the cattle were gone, even a future rain could not guarantee recovery because there were no animals left to work the fields. Tens of millions of people were trapped in this collapse, and above them, a government was making choices. What that government did with the food it controlled is the next part of this story, and it is harder to hear than the drought itself. The grain existed. That is the fact that sits at the center of the Indian famine of 1876 to 1878. While millions of people in southern and central India were starving to death, grain was being loaded onto ships in Indian ports and sailed to Britain. This was colonial policy. India was governed by the British Empire in 1877. The economy was structured to extract value from the colony and send it home. Grain was a commodity. It had a market price. And in London, the price offered for Indian grain was higher than starving Indian farmers could pay. The British colonial administration at the time was led by the Viceroy Lord Lytton, a man who held deep ideological convictions about free markets and government interference. When the famine reports began arriving in 1876 and 1877, his administration made a series of choices that researchers and historians have since described as catastrophic. Relief camps were established, but they demanded physical labor in exchange for food. People who were already weakened by months of starvation had to perform hard manual work to receive rations that were, in many camps, set below the standard a prisoner of war would receive. The ration level was based partly on a policy document that explicitly aimed to keep relief from being attractive to people who might otherwise work. Grain continued to be exported through the peak years of famine mortality. A journalist named William Digby, who witnessed the famine firsthand, documented the scale of what was happening and published accounts that caused outrage in Britain. A few British officials inside India wrote internal reports condemning the policies. Their reports were largely ignored or overruled. The death toll from the Indian portion of the famine alone is estimated by researchers at somewhere between 6 million and 10 million people. The range is wide because record-keeping was incomplete. Deaths were sometimes hidden or undercounted by local officials, and disease, which spread rapidly through weakened and displaced populations, was often recorded separately from direct starvation. Cholera and smallpox moved through famine camps and along the roads where survivors walked looking for food. Disease deaths compounded the starvation deaths. The two became inseparable in the mortality records. The bodies of people who died along roads were sometimes left unburied for days. Survivors reported passing dozens of bodies on journeys between towns. Children were abandoned by parents who could no longer feed them. Communities that had existed for generations simply ceased to function. One British officer who toured the affected districts in 1877 wrote that the level of suffering exceeded anything he had witnessed in his career, including combat. He described fields where grain had once grown containing only dust and bones. The Indian famine of 1876 to 78 remains one of the deadliest single events in the recorded history of South Asia. It destroyed a generation of farming communities. It drove millions into debt from which their families never recovered. And it happened at the same time as equally devastating events in China, Brazil, and Africa, all of them caused by the same Pacific warming, all of them happening simultaneously. The scale of what was unfolding across 4 continents at once is something that becomes clear only when you zoom out from India and see the full map. And the next stop on that map is northern China, where the story is different in detail and identical in consequence. While India starved, China was already burning. Drought had settled over northern China before the full force of the 1877 El Niño arrived. The region, known as the North China Plain, stretches across what are today the provinces of Shaanxi, Henan, and Shandong, a farming landscape covering hundreds of thousands of square miles that had fed Chinese civilization for thousands of years. In 1876, rainfall began dropping below normal. By 1877, the drought reached a severity that survivors later described as something they had no words for. The Yellow River, one of the longest and most important rivers in Asia, shrank. Tributaries that fed irrigation systems across the plain dried to trickles. Wells dropped below the depth farmers had ever dug before and still hit nothing. The soil hardened into a dense clay that crumbled to powder in the wind. Crop failure came fast. The North China Plain grew wheat and millet, staple grains that fed hundreds of millions of people. Both crops failed across enormous areas in 1877. A second consecutive failure followed in 1878. In some districts, 3 consecutive harvest failures were recorded. The Chinese government of the time, the Qing dynasty, was already under extreme strain. It had fought a series of costly wars in the previous decades. Its finances were weakened. Its administrative reach into remote provinces was inconsistent. When the famine reports arrived from the north, the government mobilized some relief efforts. Grain was shipped from other provinces. Government storehouses were opened. The scale of the disaster outran the response completely. By 1878, reports from foreign missionaries and journalists who traveled through the affected regions described conditions that matched what was happening simultaneously in India. Bodies on roadsides, villages with a fraction of their former population, markets where families sold their children because they could not feed them, entire communities reduced to eating bark, grass, and eventually leather. The death toll from the northern Chinese portion of the famine is estimated at somewhere between 9 million and 13 million people. Some historical estimates run higher. As with India, the records are incomplete, and disease deaths are tangled with starvation deaths in ways that make precision impossible. One foreign observer who passed through Shaanxi province in 1878 wrote a report that circulated widely in European and American newspapers at the time. He described a province that had been home to over 15 million people and now appeared to contain perhaps half that number. Fields lay empty. Market towns stood largely silent. The smell, he wrote, was something he never forgot. The Chinese government eventually managed to ship grain into the worst affected areas, and by late 1878, some relief began reaching survivors. But the damage to the regional population and agricultural system took decades to partially recover. Some districts never fully returned to their pre-famine population levels. Two of the world's largest and oldest civilizations, India and China, were being devastated simultaneously by the same invisible mechanism in the Pacific Ocean. And while those disasters unfolded, on the other side of the planet, an ocean away, Brazil was entering its own crisis. What was happening in South America was different in landscape and culture, but identical in the mechanics of destruction. And in one way, the Brazilian story connects directly to a pattern that scientists in 2026 are watching with serious concern. The northeastern region of Brazil is a semi-arid landscape called the Sertão. It is a vast, scrubby, sun-baked interior stretching across an area larger than the state of Texas. The Sertão runs on intermittent rains. It is not a lush tropical rainforest. The people who have farmed and herded there for centuries built their lives around the seasonal rains, storing water in cisterns and reservoirs, raising cattle that could survive on tough dry grasses, planting crops in the brief wet windows the land offered. The rains of 1877 did not come. The normal rain season for northeastern Brazil runs roughly from January through April. In 1877, the rains arrived late, fell far below normal, and ended early. The soil dried fast. The reservoirs that communities depended on shrank and then disappeared. Rivers that had run year-round, for as long as anyone could remember, stopped flowing. Cattle began dying within months of the drought beginning. This was a catastrophe on its own, separate from the crop failures, because cattle represented the stored wealth and food security of most farming families in the region. When the cattle died, the families lost both their food source and their means of economic recovery. As the drought deepened, a mass migration began. People left their villages and farms and began walking. They walked toward the coast, toward the cities, toward anywhere that might have water or food or work. These migrants were called flagelados, meaning the scourged, a name that captured something of what they were enduring. The roads and trails through the Sertão filled with families carrying whatever they could lift. The Brazilian government at the time sent some aid, but the interior was remote. Roads were poor, and the scale of displacement was beyond the administrative capacity to handle. Observers who traveled through the region in 1877 and 1878 described scenes of mass suffering that echoed the reports coming from India and China at the same moment. Disease followed the displaced population. Cholera and smallpox spread through the makeshift camps that formed on the edges of coastal cities. Smallpox, in particular, moved fast through populations that were weakened by dehydration and hunger. Estimates of deaths in northeastern Brazil during the 1877-78 drought run to around 500,000 people. The drought itself lasted into 1879 in some areas. And the deep social disruption it caused, the displacement, the debt, the loss of cattle herds that took generations to rebuild, shaped the Sertão's relationship with drought and poverty for over a century afterward. Brazil has experienced major El Niño droughts in northeastern regions repeatedly since. The mechanism that struck in 1877 still operates. The same Pacific warming that fails India's monsoon also weakens the moisture flow into northeastern Brazil, cutting its rains in years when El Niño is strong. Scientists tracking the 2026 El Niño watch list northeastern Brazil among the regions most likely to see drought conditions during a strong event. The landscape is different from 1877. There are now reservoirs, emergency systems, and drought response programs, but the physics is unchanged. And while Brazil endured its crisis, the disaster was spreading still further, to a continent that rarely appears in the histories of this famine, but whose people died in comparable numbers. Africa was next, and what El Niño did there was invisible to the world watching India and China fall. Most histories of the 1877 famine focus on India and China. They are the largest death tolls, the best documented, the most extreme in scale. But the 1877 El Niño did not limit itself to two continents. The same Pacific warming that broke India's monsoon and dried out northern China reached into southern and eastern Africa, into Australia, and into parts of the Middle East and North Africa, all at the same time. The simultaneity is the thing that makes this event unique in climate history. In southern Africa, rainfall dropped sharply across regions of present-day South Africa, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe during 1877, and into 1878. Crop failures hit communities that depended on seasonal rains for their entire food supply. Cattle losses were severe. The death toll from this portion of the disaster is the hardest to estimate because record-keeping in the region at the time was fragmentary. Researchers believe the mortality was significant, but acknowledge that a full accounting may never be possible. In parts of East Africa, the drought was compounded by existing conflict and displacement that made food systems even more fragile. The El Niño event pushed populations that were already vulnerable over the edge. Australia tells a slightly different story. During El Niño events, Australia typically experiences drought, particularly in the eastern and southeastern regions, where most of its agriculture is concentrated. The 1870-78 period brought severe drought to Australian farming regions that were at the time still being settled. Crop failures and livestock deaths were recorded across multiple colonies, and the economic damage was substantial. The death toll was lower than in Asia and Brazil, partly because European settler populations had better access to imported food and a more developed distribution system. But the key fact about Australia matters for understanding how El Niño works globally. Australia and India both suffered drought simultaneously. So did northeastern Brazil and parts of China and Africa. These are not regions that share a border or a weather system. They are scattered across the planet. What connects them is the Pacific. A warming Pacific does not send a single storm to each of these places. It reorganizes the atmospheric circulation above the entire planet. Different regions experience different effects based on their geography and their relationship to the shifted atmospheric patterns. Some get drought, some get floods. The specific impact varies. The driver is the same. Scientists who have studied the 1877 event describe it as the clearest historical example of a planetary-scale climate forced simultaneously across multiple populated regions. The term they use is teleconnection, a technical word for how a change in one part of the climate system causes effects in places that seem completely unrelated. The teleconnection of 1877 reached across roughly 8,000 miles. It connected a warming patch of water in the tropical Pacific to a dying wheat crop in Shaanxi province, a dried-out riverbed in northeastern Brazil, a failed monsoon in the Deccan, and a bleached, cracked cattle range in southern Africa, all in the same season. The combined death toll from all of these simultaneous events, when researchers add up the estimates from India, China, Brazil, Africa, and other affected regions, is placed somewhere between 30 million and 60 million people. That range is wide because the historical record is incomplete. But even the low end of that range makes this the deadliest climate event in recorded human history. And the question that researchers started asking over a century later is, was the Pacific alone responsible? The drought did not have to kill tens of millions of people. That is the conclusion that historians and climate researchers have reached after decades of studying the 1876-78 famine. The El Niño was real, the drought was severe, the crop failures were genuine, but famines on the scale that occurred in India and China required more than a weather event to reach those death tolls. They required political systems that made the wrong choices. In India, the British colonial administration controlled the food supply, the transportation network, the tax system, and the emergency response apparatus. They had the logistical capacity to move food into famine zones. They chose, repeatedly and deliberately, not to do so at the scale required. The ideological framework behind those choices was a belief in free market economics, so rigid that it treated famine relief as a threat to market function. Lord Lytton, the Viceroy, wrote to officials in his administration that providing free food to famine victims would create dependence and undermine the labour market. His government followed a policy manual, the Famine Code, that set strict limits on relief eligibility and required physical labour from recipients. Meanwhile, the same administration continued to collect land taxes from farmers in famine zones. A farmer who could not grow a crop was still expected to pay the annual tax. Failure to pay resulted in seizure of property. Some farmers who had managed to hold on to seed grain for next year's planting had it taken as tax payment. Grain exports from India to Britain continued through the famine years. The figures vary by year, but British India exported hundreds of thousands of tons of grain annually throughout the late 1870s, including during the peak famine years. Market prices in Britain and Europe made export profitable. The colonial administration did not interrupt the export trade. A journalist named William Digby spent time in famine zones and later published a book documenting what he saw and what policy caused it. He calculated roughly that the grain exported from India during the famine years was more than sufficient to have fed every person who starved to death. In China, the failure was different in character, but similar in consequence. The Qing government made genuine efforts to respond, but its administrative system was weakened by decades of internal conflicts and financial strain. Relief grain was shipped into affected provinces, but the distribution networks broke down. Local officials redirected supplies. Corruption diverted resources. The government had the intention, but not the functional capacity to match the scale of the disaster. The lesson that climate researchers and historians draw from this comparison is specific. El Niño loads the system. It removes the rainfall. It kills the crops. But whether that crop failure becomes a famine killing millions depends on what the human systems around it choose to do. A drought in a society with functional grain reserves, emergency distribution networks, and a government committed to keeping people alive is a crisis. A drought in a society structured to extract wealth rather than protect people is a catastrophe. That distinction matters enormously for how we think about the 2026 El Niño watch. The physics is the same as 1877. The political and economic structures surrounding the most vulnerable populations are not the same, but they are also not uniformly safe. Some of the regions now in El Niño's crosshairs still have the same vulnerabilities that made 1877 so deadly. 30 million, 60 million, between those two numbers sits the full range of what researchers believe the 1876-78 famine cost in human lives. The range exists because counting the dead from a famine that struck 4 continents in the 19th century, before modern census systems, before complete vital records, before international humanitarian monitoring, requires detective work across multiple disciplines. Climate scientists reconstruct the atmospheric and oceanic conditions. Historians dig through colonial records, missionary accounts, newspaper dispatches, and government reports. Demographers analyze population data before and after the famine years, trying to measure the gap between expected population growth and what actually happened. The numbers they produce are estimates, careful estimates, but estimates nonetheless. The India portion of the death toll is the most studied. Estimates from academic research range from roughly 6 million to over 10 million deaths in India alone across the famine period, including deaths from starvation, disease, and displacement. The disease deaths are significant. Cholera, smallpox, and dysentery spread rapidly through populations weakened by hunger and crowded into camps or along migration routes. In some areas, more people died from disease than from direct starvation. The China portion carries estimates of 9 million to 13 million or more. Northern China's affected provinces lost enormous fractions of their pre-famine populations. Some district records show population drops of 20 to 40% over the famine years. Brazil's toll is estimated in the hundreds of thousands, smaller in absolute number than India or China, but devastating relative to the population of the affected region. Africa's toll is the least known. The combination of sparse record-keeping, ongoing colonial disruptions, and the political invisibility of African populations in 19th century documentation means researchers can identify that mortality occurred on a significant scale, but cannot pin precise figures to it. When researchers add these regional estimates together and try to account for the parts of the record that are missing, the result is the range of 30 to 60 million deaths. Some individual researchers have placed the total at the higher end or even above 60 million. Others argue for conservative estimates closer to 30 million. The debate continues. What is not in debate is that this was the deadliest climate-linked catastrophe in the written historical record. The Black Death of the 14th century killed more people in total, but it operated over a longer period and through a biological mechanism. The 1877 famine killed its tens of millions over roughly 2 years, triggered by a single climate event, in a pattern of simultaneous regional collapses. For almost a century after the famine, no one fully understood what had caused it. The droughts were documented. The failures of governance were debated, but the connection to the Pacific, to a warming ocean thousands of miles from the worst affected populations, was invisible. It took the work of climate scientists in the late 20th and early 21st century to close that loop. Researchers who dug through historical climate proxies, ice cores, tree rings, and coral records eventually reconstructed the oceanic conditions of 1877 with enough precision to say, with confidence, a super El Niño caused the drought conditions that drove this famine. And the story of how scientists figured that out, working backward through time with tools the victims never had, is one of the most remarkable investigations in climate science history. No one in 1877 knew they were dying because of a warming patch of water in the Pacific Ocean. The scientists who eventually proved that connection were working almost a century later with tools that did not exist during the famine itself. Their investigation was, in every sense, a cold case. The problem was that direct ocean temperature records from the tropical Pacific in the 1870s are nearly non-existent. There were no monitoring buoys. There were no research ships making systematic measurements along the equator. A few ship logs from the era recorded surface temperatures at specific locations on specific dates, but the coverage was too sparse to reconstruct what the Pacific was actually doing in real time. So researchers turned to proxies. A climate proxy is any natural record that captures information about past climate conditions. Coral skeletons grow in layers, and the chemistry of each layer reflects the temperature and salinity of the water when it formed. Tree rings record growth rates that respond to temperature and moisture. Ice cores from glaciers in the Andes and the Himalayas preserve records of past precipitation chemistry. Cave formations called stalagmites grow in ways that reflect regional rainfall. By pulling together proxy records from coral reefs in the Pacific, tree rings from North America and Asia, and ice cores from South American glaciers, researchers assembled a picture of what the tropical Pacific was doing in 1877. They compared that picture to the known conditions during major modern El Niño events that were directly measured. The match was striking. The 1877 proxy records showed ocean surface warming in the central and eastern Pacific, consistent with a strong to exceptional El Niño. The timing of that warming lined up precisely with the timing of the monsoon failures in India, the drought onset in northern China, and the rainfall collapse in northeastern Brazil. A research team that published findings in a major climate journal cross-referenced the proxy data with historical famine records, agricultural reports, and meteorological observations from missionary and colonial sources in each affected region. They found that the geographical pattern of drought and flood during 1877 to 1878 matched the known El Niño teleconnection pattern almost exactly. Southern and central India entered drought, northern China entered drought, northeastern Brazil entered drought, all at once, all fitting the pattern that researchers had mapped from modern El Niño events using satellite data. The conclusion held up across multiple independent lines of evidence. The 1877 to 78 event was a super El Niño, probably one of the strongest in at least 500 years. Its effects reached 4 continents simultaneously, and the death toll of tens of millions resulted from the collision between a climate extreme and political systems that failed to protect their most vulnerable people. That finding changed how researchers think about climate history. It established that El Niño events are capable of causing global-scale humanitarian disasters. It proved that no region that depends on rainfall for food is completely isolated from what happens in the tropical Pacific, and it created the scientific foundation for modern El Niño monitoring programs, which now track Pacific conditions in near real time using over 70 ocean buoys and dozens of satellites. The scientists who built those monitoring systems were motivated, at least in part, by what they had learned about 1877. They wanted to ensure that the world would never again be completely surprised by a super El Niño. The next question is whether they succeeded, and the answer starts with a night in 1982 when the Pacific began doing something unusual, and no one was ready for it. The buoys were supposed to catch it. By the early 1980s, NOAA had deployed a network of moored ocean buoys along the equatorial Pacific. They were designed to measure ocean temperature, wind speed, and other conditions, feeding data into forecast models that scientists hoped would provide early warning of major El Niño events. The monitoring system represented a major investment. Scientists were confident they were building a better watch. Then the biggest El Niño in modern memory, up to that point, snuck past them almost completely. The 1982 to 83 event began building in the spring of 1982. In April, Pacific winds near the international dateline showed unusual weakening. Ocean temperatures in the central Pacific began rising. The Bjerknes feedback, the loop where warming water weakens the winds and weaker winds allow more warming, was already engaged. The buoy network missed most of it. Several key buoys along the monitoring array had malfunctioned or gone offline. A major volcanic eruption in Mexico in the spring of '82 created atmospheric aerosols that confused satellite temperature readings of the ocean surface. The forecast models were still primitive by later standards and interpreted the early signals incorrectly. By October of 1982, when the event was already massive and still growing, scientists finally recognized what was happening. The Central Pacific was warmer than it had been in any living forecaster's memory. The event they had been building systems to detect had arrived, and they had almost completely missed the warning window. The consequences came fast. Peru and Ecuador received catastrophic floods beginning in late 1982. Normally arid coastal areas received years' worth of rainfall in weeks. Rivers overflowed, bridges washed out, communities that had no infrastructure for heavy rain were overwhelmed. Crops planted for the dry season were destroyed. Livestock drowned. Simultaneously, Australia fell into one of its worst droughts on record. Massive fires swept through the state of Victoria in February of 1983, killing over 70 people and destroying thousands of homes. Wildfire conditions were extreme across southeastern Australia. In southern Africa, drought gripped Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa simultaneously. Corn harvests collapsed. Cattle losses were severe. Food insecurity spread across a region that was already economically fragile. Indonesia and the Philippines experienced drought and fire. Coral bleaching events struck reefs across the Pacific as ocean temperatures rose above what reef organisms could tolerate. The global economic damage from the event ran to tens of billions of dollars across all affected regions. The death toll from the combined effects, floods, fires, famine, and disease, reached into the thousands. A far cry from 1877, but still a significant catastrophe for a world that had believed its monitoring systems were ready. The 1882-83 event taught researchers three things they had not fully learned before. First, a super El Niño can develop faster than early models predicted. Second, monitoring networks need redundancy because single points of failure can blind the entire system. Third, even with satellite technology, the window between warning and impact can be dangerously short. The next time, they promised themselves, they would be better prepared. The next time came 15 years later, and the results were simultaneously more impressive and more humbling than anyone expected. 15 years after the 1982 surprise, scientists were ready, or so they believed. The 1997-98 El Niño gave them their first real-time test of the monitoring system they had spent a decade and a half building. By 1997, the equatorial Pacific was covered by a network of 70 moored buoys called the Tropical Atmosphere Ocean Array, plus dozens of ocean temperature sensors, satellite systems tracking sea surface temperature across the entire Pacific basin, and atmospheric monitoring stations on remote islands. The forecast models had been rebuilt multiple times. The event was detected early. By the spring of 1997, scientists were watching the trade winds weaken and ocean temperatures in the central Pacific rise at a rate that looked alarming. By May, the event had already exceeded strong status. By summer, it was clear this was going to be exceptional. Forecasters issued warnings. Governments received briefings. Aid agencies began pre-positioning supplies in regions identified as high risk. For the first time in history, a major El Niño event was being tracked in near real time as it developed, and the world was being warned. The warnings helped. Emergency agencies in Peru prepared flood defenses. Southern African governments activated drought response plans. Some agricultural regions planted alternative crops based on forecasts. People who received the warnings and had the resources to act on them were better protected than they had been in '82. The event still caused massive damage. Peru flooded catastrophically. Entire coastal towns were washed away. A stretch of the Pan American Highway near the town of Punta Negra was destroyed by floodwaters for weeks at a time. The economic losses in Peru from this single event exceeded $3 billion. Indonesia experienced a drought so severe that it combined with widespread burning of forest land to create smoke hazes that blanketed large areas of Southeast Asia for months. The smoke affected air quality across Malaysia, Singapore, and parts of the Philippines. Airlines diverted flights. Hospitals reported spikes in respiratory illnesses. East Africa received massive and destructive flooding in Kenya and Somalia, linked to the same El Niño dynamics that were drying out other regions simultaneously. Over 1,000 people died in those floods. Across the globe, researchers estimated over 30,000 deaths were linked to the event. The economic damage, when tallied across all affected countries, exceeded $45 billion, and the global average temperature in 1998 set a new record for the warmest year measured up to that point, driven in part by the enormous heat that El Niño released from the ocean into the atmosphere. The 1997-98 event became the most studied climate episode in history. Research papers analyzing its mechanics, its regional impacts, its predictability, and its connections to climate change filled journals for the following decade. The data collected from that single event transformed the science of El Niño forecasting. Scientists emerged from it with better models, better understanding of the global teleconnection patterns, and a sharper picture of where the next Super El Niño would hit hardest. They waited 17 years to apply that knowledge, and the next one in 2015 showed them that even with everything they had learned, some impacts still exceeded all expectations. By 2015, scientists had the best monitoring system in history. Satellites tracked Pacific Ocean temperatures every day. The buoy array had been upgraded and expanded. Forecast models ran on supercomputers with decades of observational data feeding their calculations. The global weather agency community had practiced El Niño response protocols across multiple previous events. The world was as prepared as it had ever been. The 2015-16 El Niño became the most intense since the 1997 benchmark, and by some measurements it exceeded it. Ocean temperatures in the key monitoring zone of the Pacific peaked at roughly 2.5 degrees Celsius above the long-term average in the late months of 2015. That placed it firmly in super territory. The event ran for about 15 months from formation to decay, and its effects reached every region of the globe that climate scientists had predicted would be affected. The Great Barrier Reef, a coral system stretching over 1,400 miles along the northeastern coast of Australia and covering an area larger than the state of Montana, suffered the most catastrophic bleaching event in its recorded history. Bleaching occurs when ocean temperatures rise above a coral's tolerance threshold for long enough that the coral expels the algae living inside it, turning white and becoming vulnerable to disease and death. In 2016, surveys found that over 60% of corals in the northern section of the Great Barrier Reef had died from the bleaching event. Ethiopia entered a drought that the United Nations described as the worst in over 30 years. Around 10 million people required emergency food assistance. Livestock died across the pastoralist regions of the country. The drought persisted into 2016, compounding the crisis. Southern Africa faced a drought that stretched across multiple countries simultaneously. Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique all declared national disasters. Corn, the primary food crop for hundreds of millions of people across the region, failed across enormous areas. The United Nations World Food Programme issued emergency appeals for funding at a scale that exceeded previous El Niño responses. India experienced a severe drought in its central and southern regions during 2015-16 that affected millions of farmers. Reservoir levels dropped to historic lows in some states. Water rationing was imposed in cities. Agricultural losses ran into billions of dollars. In South America, the event brought destructive flooding to parts of Bolivia, Paraguay, and southern Brazil. Tens of thousands of people were displaced. Globally, around 60 million people faced food insecurity linked to the event. The global average temperature in 2016 became the warmest year ever recorded in modern history, a record that stood for several years before being eventually surpassed. And then the 2015-16 event ended. The Pacific cooled, the trade winds recovered, the atmospheric circulation slowly returned toward its normal pattern. Scientists exhaled. For about 7 years, the Pacific stayed in a pattern that did not produce a super event. Until 2023. What happened in 23 to 24 is a preview of what the 2026 watch might mean for the regions now sitting in El Niño's crosshairs. And the numbers from that recent event make it impossible to dismiss the current warning as noise. 7 years after the 2015-16 super event, the Pacific heated up again. The 2023-24 El Niño formed quickly. By the summer of 23, ocean temperatures in the central Pacific were rising fast. By autumn, the event had crossed into strong territory. The United Nations later classified it as one of the 5 strongest El Niño events ever recorded. The world had better tools than ever. Satellite coverage was more detailed. Forecast models had been refined using data from every previous major event. International response systems had been stress-tested repeatedly. Aid agencies had playbooks developed specifically for El Niño scenarios. And still, over 60 million people were affected. Southern Africa took the hardest hit. Drought gripped Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique simultaneously. Corn harvests, the food staple for hundreds of millions of people across the region, failed across enormous areas. Zambia declared a national disaster. Zimbabwe did the same. Malawi followed. These three declarations happened within weeks of each other, a cascade of government responses that signaled how fast the crisis was moving. Over 30 million people in Southern Africa alone faced food insecurity during the peak of the event. Emergency food pipelines that the World Food Programme had built over years were stretched to their limits, trying to reach remote rural communities where crop failures had been total. In Brazil, the same event that was drying out Southern Africa was pumping excess moisture into the south of the country. In May of 2024, catastrophic flooding hit the state of Rio Grande do Sul, one of Brazil's most productive agricultural regions. Rivers rose to levels not recorded in living memory. The floods killed over 100 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. Entire towns were submerged. Bridges collapsed. Roads became rivers. The two disasters happened simultaneously, one continent drying out and one flooding, both driven by the same Pacific warming, the same mechanism, two opposite outcomes, happening in the same weeks. Globally, the 2023-24 event also pushed average temperatures to new highs. The year 2023 became the warmest year in recorded history. 2024 exceeded it. Back-to-back record years, both amplified by the heat El Niño released from the ocean into the atmosphere. The event ended in the first half of 2025. Scientists watched the Pacific cool. The trade winds recovered. Normal patterns began reasserting themselves. But the damage to food systems, to emergency funding reserves, to communities that had just begun rebuilding after previous climate shocks, was substantial. And the recovery period was short, because by May of 2026, NOAA was already issuing a new watch. The Pacific was warming again, and scientists studying the background conditions, the ocean heat content, the atmospheric pressure patterns, the trade wind behavior, could see that the next event was forming faster than average. The system was primed. The question hanging over every climate agency in the world in the summer of 26 was whether the recovery time between the 23 to 24 event and whatever was building now was long enough for the most vulnerable regions to restore their food reserves, rebuild their emergency capacity, and prepare their populations. For some regions, the answer was clearly no. What those regions look like right now, which communities are sitting in the crosshairs of the 2026 event, and why their exposure is not the same as in previous cycles, is the story the next chapters will tell. Southern Africa has a problem that goes beyond any single drought. The region sits in a location on Earth where El Niño almost always means less rain. When the Pacific warms and the atmospheric circulation shifts, the moisture that normally flows inland across Southern Africa during the summer growing season weakens. Sometimes it just runs thin. During a strong or super event, it can effectively disappear for an entire season. For a region where most farming is rain-fed, where irrigation covers only a small fraction of cropland, and where corn is the dominant staple crop for hundreds of millions of people, a single failed rainy season is a crisis. 2 consecutive failures, as happened in 23 to 24, can destabilize entire national food systems. The growing season in Southern Africa runs roughly from November through March. Farmers plant when the first rains arrive in late spring and harvest in autumn. The window is specific. Miss the planting rains and the whole season is lost, because replanting later means the crop matures in dry conditions anyway. During the 23 to 24 El Niño, the planting rains across Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi arrived late, ran below normal levels, and ended early. Farmers who planted on time watched their seedlings stall. Farmers who waited for the rains to strengthen before planting ran out of time. Either way, the outcome was the same. Yields collapsed. Corn production in Zimbabwe dropped by roughly half compared to a normal year. Zambia's harvest was similarly devastated. Malawi, which was already managing food insecurity from previous climate shocks, saw its situation deteriorate rapidly. By early 24, all three governments had declared national disasters and formally requested international emergency food aid. The World Food Programme mobilized. Emergency grain shipments arrived. School feeding programs were scaled up. Cash transfer programs were expanded to help families buy food in local markets. These responses saved lives, but they were expensive, slow to reach remote areas, and contingent on international donors providing funding at the scale needed. When the 2026 El Niño watch was issued, Southern Africa had not fully recovered from 23 to 24. Grain reserves in several countries were still below normal. Household-level food stocks, the grain that families store at home to bridge the months between harvests, were depleted in many communities. The livestock herds that farmers sell in emergencies to buy food had been thinned by the previous drought. The region entered the window of a new potential El Niño event in a weaker position than it had entered the last one. Climate scientists place Southern Africa in the highest risk category for the 2026 to 27 season if the forming El Niño reaches strong or super levels. The growing season that will determine whether millions of people have enough to eat begins in November of 26. That is inside the window when the current event is projected to be at or near its peak. The communities most exposed are the ones farthest from roads, markets, and government services. Small-scale farmers in rural Zimbabwe, subsistence households in northern Malawi, pastoralists in southern Zambia whose cattle are already fewer than they were 5 years ago. These are people with no buffer. When the rain fails, there is nothing between them and hunger, except the speed of an international response system that is already stretched. And Southern Africa is only one of the regions now in the path of what is building in the Pacific. Across the world, in places with different landscapes and different vulnerabilities, the same pattern is coming. The state of Rio Grande do Sul sits at the bottom of Brazil. It is not the Brazil of postcards. No jungle, no carnival heat. This is a temperate farming landscape, green and flat, cut through by rivers and covered with soybean fields, rice paddies, and cattle pastures. It produces a significant share of Brazil's food. It is prosperous by Brazilian standards. It has infrastructure, roads, hospitals, and functional government services. In May of 2024, it went underwater. The trigger was the same El Niño event that was simultaneously drying out southern Africa. During El Niño, northeastern Brazil typically gets less rain, and southern Brazil often gets more. This is the teleconnection flipping outcomes across different parts of the same country at the same time. The north dries, the south floods. The mechanism is consistent across multiple events. In May 24, a series of intense storm systems moved across Rio Grande do Sul over several days. The soil, already saturated from above-average rainfall earlier in the season, absorbed what it could and then shed the rest. Rivers in the region, including the Jacui, the Taquari, and dozens of smaller channels, rose faster than any recorded measurement in living memory. Some stations recorded water levels over 10 feet above their previous historical maximum. Towns built along river valleys flooded within hours. Residents in some areas had almost no time to evacuate. Roads turned into rivers. Cars floated down main streets. Emergency services were overwhelmed across multiple municipalities simultaneously. By the time the waters peaked, over 100 people had died. More than 300,000 people had been displaced from their homes. An estimated 500,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. Agricultural losses across the state ran into billions of dollars. Rice crops, which were close to harvest, were submerged entirely. Cattle operations lost animals and infrastructure they had built over generations. The Brazilian government mobilized a large-scale emergency response, deploying military personnel, rescue helicopters, and emergency supplies. The scale of the operation was the largest domestic disaster response in Brazilian history, and yet communities in some parts of the flood zone waited days for rescue because roads were impassable and boats were scarce. The Rio Grande do Sul flooding illustrated something that the 1877 story also shows, just from the flood side instead of the drought side. El Niño does not only kill through drought, it also kills through excess. Too much water in the wrong place is as destructive as too little water in a place that depends on rain. The mechanisms are opposite. The death toll is not. Scientists studying the 2026 forming event note that southern Brazil sits in the same risk zone for excess rainfall as it did in 24. If the event reaches strong or super levels, the conditions that produced the May 24 flooding could reoccur during the southern hemisphere summer of 26 to 27. The communities still rebuilding from 24 would face a second strike before full recovery from the first. That pattern of compounding climate disasters hitting the same region before it can recover is one of the defining risks of the current era. The 2026 El Niño is forming in a world where that pattern is already well established, and what climate change adds to that pattern changes the scale of what El Niño can do. That connection is the next piece of this story. Numbers can mislead, especially when the news needs a headline. When NOAA issued its El Niño Watch on May 14, 2026, the report contained two very different sets of information sitting side by side. Most headlines grabbed one and ignored the other. The first set was the formation probability, an 82% chance of El Niño forming between May and July of 26, a 96% chance it would persist through the winter of 26 into 27. These are high numbers. In the language of climate forecasting, a 96% probability of persistence is as close to a certainty as seasonal forecasters ever state publicly. Something is coming. That part of the warning is solid. The second set of numbers was the strength forecast, and this is where the headlines diverged from the science. NOAA's May 26 outlook broke down the probability that the event would reach each intensity level: weak, moderate, strong, or super. The probabilities were spread across all four categories. No single category exceeded 37%. That means the most likely single outcome, by the numbers, was actually a moderate event. A moderate El Niño is disruptive. The honest reading of the forecast is that a significant El Niño is very likely forming. Its eventual strength is genuinely uncertain. The scientists who wrote the report do not know yet whether this will be a moderate event that causes regional disruptions, a strong event that strains global food systems, or a super event that reaches the threshold of 2015 to 16. The data will not resolve that question until the event develops further into mid-26. What the forecasters do know is that the background conditions favor a stronger event than average. Ocean heat content in the Western Pacific, the reservoir that feeds El Niño events once they form, is elevated above historical baselines. That extra stored heat means the event, once it forms, has more energy available to draw on. The atmospheric conditions are also favorable for coupling, meaning the atmosphere and ocean are likely to reinforce each other as the event develops. But favorable conditions for a strong event are not the same as a confirmed strong event. Climate scientists who study forecast uncertainty describe this phase of an El Niño cycle, the watch phase before the event peaks, as the period of maximum uncertainty. The system is in motion. Its final destination is not yet fixed. Understanding the difference between a watch and a confirmed forecast matters for how governments and aid agencies respond. An 82% formation probability means food agencies should start pre-positioning emergency supplies now. It means governments in high-risk regions should activate drought contingency plans now. It means international funders should release preparedness money now. It does not mean the outcome is already written, and it does not mean a moderate event that causes manageable disruption should be treated as equivalent to a catastrophe in the making. The distinction matters because panic and under-preparation are both dangerous. Panic can cause governments to make costly decisions based on a worst case that does not arrive. Under-preparation can leave millions of people exposed if the worst case does arrive. Scientists are threading that needle right now. And while they do, the planet underneath the forming El Niño is warmer than it was during any previous event. That matters, because what climate change adds to a strong El Niño changes what the event can do in ways that have no historical precedent. Every El Niño in history formed in a specific ocean, a specific atmosphere, a specific planet. The 1877 event formed in a world where the average global surface temperature was roughly 1 degree Celsius cooler than it is today. The 1997 event formed in a world around half a degree cooler than today. The 2015-16 event formed in a world about 1/10 of a degree cooler than today's baseline. The 2026 event is forming in the hottest background climate ever recorded in modern history. Climate change does not create El Niño. The Pacific has been cycling through El Niño and La Niña patterns for millions of years, long before humans existed. The Bjerknes feedback, the trade wind dynamics, the oceanic heat storage mechanisms. These are features of Earth's physics, not products of industrial emissions. What climate change does is raise the floor. Imagine pouring hot coffee into a cup that is already warm versus a cup that is cold. The same amount of coffee creates a much hotter final temperature when the cup is already warm. El Niño adds heat to an atmosphere that is already elevated above historical baselines. The result is that the same Pacific warming pattern now produces higher atmospheric temperatures, more intense evaporation, more moisture in the air, and more extreme rainfall events than the same pattern would have produced 50 years ago. Drought regions hit by El Niño now experience higher baseline temperatures on top of the reduced rainfall. Higher temperatures mean faster evaporation from soil and plants. Crops that might have survived a rainfall deficit in a cooler year can fail completely in a warmer year, even with the same deficit, because the heat pulls moisture out faster, the soil dries more quickly, wells drop sooner, rivers run lower. Flood regions hit by El Niño now receive moisture-loaded air that is more saturated than it would have been in previous decades. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. When that vapor condenses and falls, it falls harder. The rainfall events that cause flooding are more intense than the same atmospheric conditions would have produced in a cooler era. Scientists describe this as El Niño impacts becoming amplified. The underlying pattern is the same. The outcomes are bigger. There is also the question of what El Niño does to global average temperatures when the background is already high. The 2023-24 El Niño helped push 2023 and 2200 to back-to-back records for the hottest years ever measured. If the 2026 event reaches strong or super strength, the years 26 and 27 could exceed those records. Record global temperatures create their own cascade of effects: heat stress on crops, increased energy demand for cooling, faster glacier and ice melt feeding into already stressed water systems, higher sea surface temperatures creating more intense hurricanes and typhoons during their seasonal windows. These effects do not replace El Niño's direct regional impacts. They compound on top of them. The planet that the 2026 El Niño is forming in is measurably different from the one that hosted any previous event in the historical or modern record. And that difference means the playbook scientists built from studying 1997 and 2015 may underestimate what this event can do. The food system will feel that difference first. A farming family in Zimbabwe does not think about El Niño. They think about rain. They watch the sky. They read the clouds. They feel the wind. They know from generations of experience roughly when the rains should start and when they should end. And when the rains fail, the first thing they lose is not their harvest. The first thing they lose is their ability to plan. Food systems are built on predictability. Farmers plant based on expected rains. They borrow seed money expecting a harvest to repay it. They time their planting to match the soil moisture cycle. They keep a reserve of grain from the previous harvest, calculated to last until the next one arrives. The whole system runs on the assumption that this season will roughly resemble last season. El Niño breaks that assumption. When rainfall drops well below normal at planting time, farmers face a choice with no good options. Plant now in dry soil and risk the seeds failing to germinate. Wait for rain that may never come and lose the planting window entirely. The decision is a guess, and farmers in subsistence agriculture cannot afford to guess wrong. If the harvest fails, the cascade moves fast. Within weeks of a failed harvest, local food prices start rising because the supply has dropped. Families who need to buy food in markets find it costs more precisely when they have less money because the harvest that would have paid their debts did not come. Savings are drawn down. Livestock are sold, often at depressed prices, because many families are selling at the same time for the same reason. By month 3 or 4 after a harvest failure, families in the most vulnerable situations have spent their savings, sold their livestock, and are reducing how many meals they eat per day. Children's nutrition suffers first. Stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and increased susceptibility to disease follow. By month 6, without outside intervention, mortality begins rising. The deaths are not always recorded as famine deaths. Children die of diarrhea that their weakened bodies cannot fight. Adults die of respiration infections that a well-nourished person would survive. The connection between the failed harvest and the death gets lost in the disease record. This cascade does not require a super El Niño. A strong El Niño producing a 30% rainfall deficit in southern Africa is enough to trigger it across communities that are already operating near the margin. The margin has been getting thinner. Climate shocks in previous years have reduced household grain reserves and livestock holdings. Conflict in several regions has disrupted farming and displaced populations. Rising food prices globally have made import-dependent countries more vulnerable because the cost of buying food internationally has increased. Debt levels in several heavily exposed countries mean governments have less fiscal room to fund emergency responses. The food system that will face the 2026 El Niño is more brittle in key places than the system that faced 2015 or 23. And El Niño, if it reaches strong levels, will push on those brittle points with exactly the same force it always has. The specific regions where those brittle points are most concentrated make the map of current vulnerability look very similar to the map of 1877. Different countries, different governments, the same physics, and some of the same underlying fragility. A strong El Niño does not hit everywhere equally. It has a pattern. Scientists have mapped that pattern across dozens of events. The map is not perfect, and the timing shifts between events, but the broad geography of who gets drought and who gets flood during a strong Pacific warming is consistent enough to plan around. The regions most reliably in the drought crosshairs during a strong El Niño are Southern Africa, Southeastern Australia, Central America, and Mexico's Pacific coast, parts of the Caribbean, and large areas of South and Southeast Asia, including India, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. The regions most reliably in the flood crosshairs are coastal Peru and Ecuador, parts of East Africa including Kenya and Ethiopia, the Gulf Coast of the United States, and southern Brazil. For the 2026-27 event, climate scientists have flagged several of these regions as carrying elevated risk based on current conditions on the ground. Southeast Asia deserves particular attention. Indonesia and the Philippines are home to combined populations of well over 500 million people. Both countries are heavily dependent on rain-fed agriculture. Both have seen rapid population growth that has increased the number of people who need to be fed from the same land. During strong El Niño events, Reduced rainfall across these countries cuts into rice production, the primary food for most of the region. Indonesia experienced severe drought and fire during the 1997-98 event. The smoke haze it produced affected air quality across Southeast Asia for months. The 2015-16 event brought another significant drought. A new strong event arriving before agricultural systems have been restructured to handle rainfall variability creates the same exposure again. India adds another layer of complexity. Over 1 billion people depend partially on Indian agricultural output, and India's rain-fed farming regions in central and southern states are consistently vulnerable during El Niño years. The 2023-24 event produced drought conditions in several Indian states and cut into domestic crop yields. Another significant event arriving in the same region a few years later hits farmers who have not fully rebuilt their reserves. Central America is often overlooked in global El Niño discussions because the affected population is smaller in absolute number than in Asia or Africa. But the region's food systems are fragile, and El Niño droughts in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have historically driven significant hunger and migration. During strong events, the dry corridor of Central America, a geographic strip running through the Pacific-facing slopes of the region, can experience near-total crop failure. Australia watches El Niño with the specific dread of a continent that has lived through its consequences repeatedly. Eastern and southeastern Australia, where most agricultural production is concentrated, falls into drought during most strong El Niño events. The agricultural sector is large enough and export-oriented enough that Australian drought during an El Niño year also affects global grain markets, compounding food price pressure on import-dependent countries elsewhere. Each of these regions has its own political system, its own level of preparedness, and its own specific vulnerabilities. What they share is a position on the map relative to the Pacific that puts them in the path of what is building. And what builds inside the atmosphere during a strong El Niño does something else entirely to the global temperature record that affects everyone, not just the drought zones. The Pacific Ocean is not just the largest body of water on Earth, it is the planet's largest heat reservoir. Over years and decades, the tropical Pacific absorbs enormous amounts of solar energy. That energy does not stay on the surface. It sinks. It gets carried downward by ocean circulation, stored in the deep layers of the water column, hidden from the atmosphere above. During La Niña years, when the trade winds are strong and push warm water west, the ocean holds even more heat in storage. The atmosphere gets a brief reprieve. During El Niño, that stored heat surfaces when the warm water slides east and the deep cold upwelling of South America weakens. Heat that the ocean has been holding for months or years suddenly becomes available to the atmosphere. It evaporates upward, it drives massive convective systems, it pumps energy high into the troposphere, and the global average temperature rises as a result. The relationship is consistent and measurable. El Niño years are almost always warmer than average global temperatures would otherwise be. La Niña years are usually slightly cooler. The Pacific is cycling heat in and out of the atmosphere on a timescale of 2 to 7 years, and the global temperature record bounces along with it. The 2015-16 event pushed global average temperatures to their highest point ever recorded at the time. The year 2016 was the warmest year in modern history when it happened. The 2023-24 event helped make 2023 and 24 even warmer, breaking the 2016 record. This matters for more than just temperature records. Global average temperature affects almost every other climate system on the planet. Higher global temperatures mean faster ice melt from glaciers and polar ice sheets. Glaciers in the Himalayas, the Andes and the Alps feed rivers that hundreds of millions of people depend on for drinking water and irrigation. When glaciers retreat, those rivers eventually run lower and more seasonally variable than they do today. An El Niño year that temporarily shrinks glaciers further accelerates a long-term trend that cannot be reversed on human timescales. Higher global temperatures during El Niño years also mean more intense hurricane and typhoon seasons in their respective basins. The North Atlantic hurricane season, which runs from June through November, overlaps with the peak of El Niño development. Warmer sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico fuel stronger storms. The 2026 Atlantic hurricane season, forming in the same window as the developing El Niño, carries elevated risk from both the background warming and the additional heat El Niño injects into the system. For communities along coastlines from the Gulf of Mexico to the Caribbean to Southeast Asia, El Niño's role as a heat pump from the ocean to the atmosphere is as relevant as its role in disrupting rainfall patterns inland. The planet's thermostat is being pushed up, and that extra heat does not only affect temperature records, it creates conditions that make a different specific type of disaster dramatically more likely. A disaster that moves fast, burns bright, and leaves landscapes that take decades to recover. A drought does not have to last long to load a landscape with fuel. When rainfall drops below normal for even one growing season, grasses dry out, shrubs lose their moisture, dead plant material accumulates on the ground without the decomposition that a normal wet season would drive. Forests that would normally be too moist to burn easily become networks of dry, connected vegetation. The landscape fills with fuel, invisible from above, ready. All it needs is an ignition source. El Niño and wildfire are linked across multiple continents. The connection runs through drought. When El Niño dries out a region, it creates fire conditions that can persist for an entire season. The longer the dry period runs, the more the fuel load builds, and the warmer temperatures that accompany El Niño year dry the fuel faster and more completely than a cooler drought would. Indonesia showed the world this connection most dramatically in 1997 to 98. The drought that El Niño brought to the Indonesian archipelago overlapped with a practice of burning land to clear it for agriculture and palm oil plantations. In a normal wet year, those fires are manageable. They burn the intended area and self-extinguish when they hit vegetation with enough moisture to resist. In 1997, the fires did not self-extinguish. They spread. The peatlands of Borneo and Sumatra, thick layers of ancient compressed organic matter that can burn underground as well as on the surface, ignited and kept burning for months. By the peak of the fire season, satellites detected over 10,000 separate fire points across the Indonesian archipelago. The smoke that resulted was extraordinary. A haze blanketed Singapore, Malaysia, and parts of the Philippines and Thailand. For weeks, airlines cancelled flights into the region. Airports shut down. Hospitals across the affected area reported significant spikes in respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular events among elderly populations. The World Health Organization estimated the long-term health impact as significant in countries far outside Indonesia's borders. Australia experiences the El Niño wildfire connection almost every cycle. The Black Saturday fires in Victoria in February 29, one of the deadliest wildfire events in Australian history, occurred during an El Niño year. The catastrophic bushfire season of 2019 to 2020, which burned over 46 million acres across southeastern Australia, developed during an El Niño-influenced period of exceptional drought and heat. The 2019 to 2020 Australian fires produced smoke that circled the globe. Atmospheric scientists tracked the smoke cloud as it travelled from Australia, across the Pacific, across South America, and eventually back around to Australian skies weeks later. The fires affected air quality on every continent. As climate change raises background temperatures during El Niño events, the fire seasons that follow El Niño-driven droughts become longer and more intense. Regions that historically burned occasionally are burning more frequently. The fuel load that accumulates between fires is not being fully cleared by each event because fire seasons end before everything burns, so the next fire season starts with more fuel than the previous one left behind. The 2026 event, if it reaches strong or super levels, will produce drought conditions across regions that already carry elevated fuel loads from previous seasons. The wildfire risk is compounding in the same way the food risk is compounding. And one more disaster type compounds alongside both of them, moving through the very population that hunger and fire have already weakened. Drought kills slowly, floods kill fast. Disease can do both. El Niño's relationship with disease outbreaks is less visible than its relationship with food systems or wildfires, but it is consistent, documented across multiple events, and responsible for a significant share of the total mortality linked to strong Pacific warming cycles. The mechanisms are several, and they operate differently depending on whether a region is experiencing drought or flood. In drought-affected regions, the disease risk comes primarily from water quality and population movement. When rivers shrink and wells drop, communities that depended on flowing surface water for drinking and sanitation are forced to use whatever water remains. Standing water in shrinking pools carries higher concentrations of pathogens. Cholera, which spreads through contaminated water, has followed El Niño droughts repeatedly throughout history. The 1877 famine death toll included massive cholera mortality. The mechanism has not changed. When drought forces people to migrate in search of food and water, populations concentrate in areas with limited water and sanitation infrastructure. Refugee-style camps, whether formal or informal, create conditions where disease spreads rapidly through densely packed people whose immune systems are already weakened by malnutrition. In flood-affected regions, the disease risk operates differently. Floodwaters contaminate wells and water sources. Mosquito breeding sites expand as standing water covers land surfaces that were previously dry. Malaria transmission increases in regions where the mosquito species that carry it breed in temporary pools. Studies following major El Niño events have documented significant spikes in malaria cases in East Africa, South Asia, and South America in the 1 to 2 years following peak El Niño conditions. The leptospirosis risk during flooding events is also significant. This bacterial infection spreads when floodwaters contaminated by animal urine contact human skin or mucous membranes. During the 2024 Brazil floods, health authorities tracked a spike in leptospirosis cases across Rio Grande do Sul in the weeks following the peak floodwaters. Dengue fever shows a different El Niño relationship. In some regions, warmer and wetter conditions expand the range and breeding season of the mosquito species that carry dengue. Scientists have documented correlations between El Niño years and dengue outbreak intensity across several parts of Southeast Asia and South America. The disease burden that follows a major El Niño event routinely outlasts the event itself by months or years. Food insecurity weakens immune systems across entire populations, making them more susceptible to infections they would otherwise fight off. Healthcare systems strained by the immediate disaster responses have fewer resources to handle the disease burden that follows. The deaths keep accumulating long after the drought ends or the floods recede. This extended mortality is one reason the historical death tolls from events like the 1877 famine run into tens of millions. The drought lasted 2 years. The famine mortality peaked during and just after the drought. The disease mortality continued for years beyond that, in communities whose populations were nutritionally compromised and whose water and sanitation systems had been disrupted. The same pattern, compressed in scale but identical in mechanism, followed every modern Super El Niño, and it will follow the 2026 event if it reaches significant strength. What separates the likely outcome of 2026 from the catastrophe of 1877 is not physics. The physics is the same. What separates them is warning time, and that warning time is only valuable if the systems receiving it can act. In 1877, the first sign of disaster was a dry sky. By the time people understood something was deeply wrong, the planting season was already over. In 2026, scientists detected the warning signal months before the event formed. That gap, The space between early warning and impact is the most important thing modern climate science has created for communities in El Niño's path. And the system that generates those warnings is one of the most complex monitoring networks ever built. The backbone is the Tropical Atmosphere Ocean Array, a grid of moored buoys stretching across the equatorial Pacific from the coast of South America to the western Pacific near Australia. Each buoy measures ocean temperature at multiple depths, wind speed and direction, air temperature, and humidity. They transmit data by satellite in near real time. Scientists watching their screens in Miami, Paris, Tokyo, and Nairobi can see the Pacific's temperature profile updating daily. The buoy network is supplemented by satellite systems that measure sea surface temperature across the entire Pacific basin. From space, dozens of research vessels that take periodic deep measurements along the equatorial track, and atmospheric monitoring stations on remote Pacific islands that track wind patterns and pressure. All of that data feeds into computer models that simulate the Pacific's future behavior. The models are not perfect. They have a known weakness in forecasting El Niño events that form in boreal spring, called the spring predictability barrier, where the natural variability of the atmosphere is high enough that small uncertainties in the initial conditions grow rapidly. That is one reason the May 2026 forecast had wide uncertainty bands around peak strength. But the models are far better than anything that existed in 1982, when the entire monitoring and modeling system failed to catch a super El Niño forming. Scientists now have months of advance notice, where they previously had weeks or nothing. The value of that advance notice depends on what happens with it. For food systems, the critical interventions require months of lead time. Seed distribution for drought-resistant crop varieties needs to reach farmers before the planting season begins. Emergency grain reserves need to be pre-positioned in affected regions before transportation networks become stressed. Cash transfer programs need to be registered and funded before the harvest fails, because families need support at the moment of crisis, not weeks later when aid systems are still organizing. In 2026, the watch was issued in May. If the event peaks in late 26, that gives the international humanitarian system roughly 6 to 8 months of lead time. That is enough time to act if the funding is released immediately and the logistical systems move without the delays that have characterized previous El Niño responses. Some of those delays are bureaucratic. Donor governments approve emergency funding faster when there is a confirmed disaster than when there is a probability forecast. But a probability forecast is what allows preemptive action that saves lives. The tension between certainty-based funding and probability-based need is one the humanitarian system has been trying to resolve for years through tools like anticipatory action funding. The warning exists. What happens next depends on the humans holding the decisions. Knowing a storm is coming does not automatically protect you from it. The 1997 to 98 El Niño was forecast months in advance. Governments received detailed briefings, aid agencies pre-positioned supplies, and the event still killed over 30,000 people and caused $45 billion in damage. The gap between knowing and acting is one of the most studied problems in disaster risk management. And the 2026 El Niño watch has arrived in a world where that gap remains real, documented, and stubbornly persistent. The first limit is political. Governments in affected regions are often reluctant to declare emergencies before a disaster is confirmed, because emergency declarations carry political costs. They can cause panic in markets. They can be used by opposition parties to claim government weakness. They require committing resources that might be needed elsewhere if the predicted event turns out weaker than feared. Waiting for certainty feels politically safer, even though climatologically, certainty arrives too late to prevent the worst outcomes. The second limit is funding. International humanitarian organizations operate on tight budgets. Emergency reserves that exist for pre-crisis action are typically smaller than the reserves available for post-disaster response. Donors who allocate emergency funding based on confirmed disasters are structurally reluctant to release the same scale of funding based on probability forecasts. The system is designed to respond, not to prevent. The third limit is logistics. Even when funding is available and governments are willing, moving large quantities of food, medical supplies, and emergency equipment into remote areas of southern Africa, interior Indonesia, or rural Central America takes time. Roads in these areas are often unpaved and seasonally impassable. Ports and warehouses have limited capacity. The supply chains that deliver emergency aid cannot simply be scaled up overnight. Researchers who study El Niño response across multiple events have found a consistent pattern. The countries that respond fastest and most effectively are the countries with the strongest pre-existing systems, reliable government infrastructure, functional road networks, trusted local institutions, and enough economic headroom to fund emergency action without waiting for international transfers. The countries most likely to need the biggest response are often the countries with the weakest versions of all those things. This is the fundamental paradox of disaster risk. Vulnerability concentrates exactly where the capacity to respond is lowest. The 2026 watch has arrived with better monitoring, better models, and better international coordination mechanisms than any previous El Niño in history. But the communities sitting in the highest risk zones are carrying more accumulated damage from previous climate shocks, more debt, more food system fragility, and less political and institutional capacity than the same communities faced in 2015. The warning is the best humanity has ever produced. The question is whether the systems around the warning are up to the task of converting it into action fast enough to matter. El Niño does not choose its victims by geography alone. The Pacific warming pattern determines which regions get drought and which get flood. But whether that drought or flood becomes a localized crisis or a cascading catastrophe depends on economic and political conditions that have nothing to do with rainfall. This is the lesson that 1877 proved and every major El Niño event since has reinforced. The link between economic fragility and climate vulnerability runs through several specific mechanisms. The first is food import dependence. Countries that produce most of their own food can manage a domestic crop failure through reserves and international purchasing. Countries that already import a large share of their food have less domestic buffer. And when global food prices spike because El Niño damages crop production across multiple regions simultaneously, their import bills rise precisely when their domestic food security is already weakened. The second mechanism is debt. Heavily indebted governments have less fiscal space to fund emergency responses. When a crop failure strikes and the government needs to deploy emergency grain reserves, expand food assistance programs, or repair flood-damaged infrastructure, countries with high debt-to-income ratios often face the choice between emergency spending and debt service payments. International debt relief programs exist, but move slowly relative to the speed of a food crisis. The third is conflict. Active conflict zones have the highest climate vulnerability of any category. Conflict disrupts farming, displaces agricultural populations, destroys infrastructure, and prevents emergency aid from reaching affected communities. Several of the regions most exposed to the 2026 El Niño rainfall pattern, including parts of East Africa, the Sahel, and Central America, are also managing ongoing conflict or political instability. The fourth is governance quality. Countries with functional civil service systems, transparent emergency management processes, and trusted local institutions can mobilize responses faster and more efficiently than countries where government capacity is weak, where aid is diverted by corruption, or where information about food security conditions is politically sensitive and unreported. When researchers map economic fragility against El Niño climate exposure for the 2026 event, the overlap between high climate risk and high economic vulnerability is concentrated in specific places. Parts of the Horn of Africa, Central America's dry corridor, southern Madagascar, northern Mozambique, parts of the Philippines, and eastern Indonesia. These are not the poorest places on Earth in absolute terms. They are the places where the combination of climate exposure, economic brittleness, food import dependence, and institutional weakness creates the conditions where a strong El Niño can escalate from a regional drought into a multi-year food security crisis. The global food system connects these vulnerable points in ways that can amplify the damage further. If Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America all experience crop failures in the same El Niño year, global grain prices rise. Rising global prices make the import bills of food deficit countries even larger at exactly the moment those countries need to import more grain to compensate for their domestic failures. This is the compound disaster scenario that concerns humanitarian planners most. Individual regional crises are manageable. Simultaneous regional crises, stressing the same global food system at the same time, test the system in ways that have not been fully tested since the 1970s. Every El Niño is the same mechanism. Every El Niño plays out in a different world. The 2026 event is forming in a world that is measurably different from the world of any previous event in the scientific record, including 2023, 2015, and 1997. Several of those differences increase the potential for impact in ways that do not have a direct historical parallel. The first difference is the baseline temperature. The global average surface temperature in 2026 sits roughly 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. That is the threshold that international climate agreements identified as the critical boundary for limiting the most severe climate impacts. Reaching or crossing it does not flip a switch. But it means every climate event, including El Niño, is now operating in a heat environment that amplifies extremes in a way that the climate system has not experienced in the modern era. The second difference is ocean heat content. The amount of heat stored in the upper levels of the global ocean has been rising consistently for decades. The Pacific is warmer at depth than it was during previous major El Niño events. When the warm surface water that drives El Niño draws on a deeper and hotter reservoir, the event can sustain itself longer and reach higher peak temperatures than the same atmospheric triggering conditions would have produced in earlier decades. The third difference is the reduced recovery window. The 2023-24 event ended in the first half of 2025. By the time the 2026 watch was issued in May, just over a year had passed since the peak of the previous event. Southern African grain reserves had not been fully restocked. Brazilian farming communities still rebuilding from the 2024 floods were not yet recovered. Indonesian farmers who had drawn down savings during 23-24 drought had not rebuilt their economic buffers. The fourth difference is the state of reef systems and ecosystems. The coral bleaching events of 2015-16 and 23-24 have already killed significant portions of tropical reef systems. Reefs that have died cannot provide the coastal protection and marine food production they previously offered. A new major bleaching event in 26-27 would strike reef systems that are still recovering, or in some areas, systems that have passed ecological tipping points and cannot recover on human timescales. The fifth difference is information saturation. The world has more data on El Niño risk than ever before. The warning system is better than it has ever been. And the public conversation around climate events, shaped by 20 years of news coverage of wildfires, floods, and droughts, has a literacy that did not exist in 1997. Whether that literacy translates into faster political action, better funded preparedness, and smarter emergency response is the question that will define whether 2026 becomes a managed crisis or a cascading catastrophe. The scientists who study El Niño today know more about it than anyone has known at any previous point in history. They also know, precisely because of how much they know, that the uncertainty about peak strength means the difference between scenarios is still enormous. By the summer of 2026, climate scientists were tracking three broad scenarios for how the forming El Niño might develop. The first scenario is a moderate event, Ocean temperatures in the Central Pacific rise above normal, but stay below the 1.5-degree threshold that defines strong status. The event causes regional disruptions across the standard impact zones. Drought conditions develop in parts of southern Africa and Southeast Asia, but do not reach the severity of 23 to 24. Flooding occurs in parts of South America and East Africa, but remains within the range of manageable crisis. Global food systems experience some price pressure, but do not face the simultaneous multi-region failure that would strain international response capacity. Humanitarian agencies handle the event with existing resources and partial preparedness actions. The world weathers it. The second scenario is a strong event. Temperatures in the Pacific monitoring zone rise above 1.5 degrees and approach 2 degrees. Southern Africa faces its third major drought in a decade. Corn production collapses across multiple countries simultaneously. The humanitarian system activates at scale, but faces the compounding challenge of responding to communities that never fully recovered from 23 to 24. Food prices rise globally as export regions in Southeast Asia and potentially Australia also see reduced harvests. International emergency funding requirements exceed what donors have pre-committed. Some communities in the highest vulnerability zones face acute food insecurity before aid pipelines can reach them. The third scenario is a super event. Pacific temperatures cross the 2-degree threshold and approach or exceed the levels seen in 2015 to 16. The impacts match or surpass the worst regional outcomes from that event. Southern Africa sees near-total corn crop failure across multiple countries. Southeast Asian rice production drops significantly. Drought-driven wildfire conditions in Indonesia and Australia produce smoke events affecting regional air quality. Brazil's southern states face flood conditions similar to or worse than May 2024. Global average temperatures in 2027 break the record set in 2024. Reef bleaching events hit systems already degraded from 2 previous mass bleaching cycles. Scientists monitoring conditions in May 2026 could not assign a probability to any single scenario that exceeded about 37%. The event was too young and the atmosphere too variable for the models to converge on a single outcome. What they could say with confidence was that the range of outcomes was wide, that the time to act was before peak development rather than after, and that the communities most at risk from the worst scenarios were the same communities that had been most damaged by previous events. The history of El Niño is, in one reading, a history of a planet discovering the same lesson repeatedly. The warning comes. The warning is calibrated, but not precise. The communities in the crosshairs are often the ones least able to act on the warning. And the gap between scientific knowledge and political action determines whether a climate event becomes a regional difficulty or a generation-defining catastrophe. What the 2026 event ultimately produces will not be determined by the Pacific. It will be determined by the choices made in the months between the watch and the peak. And what El Niño has always been telling us, from 1877 through to today, runs deeper than any single season's disaster. The Pacific has been cycling through El Niño and La Niña for millions of years. Long before humans grew crops or built cities or laid telegraph cables that would carry famine reports from India to London, the trade winds were strengthening and weakening on their irregular 2 to 7 year rhythm. The warm water was sliding east and then pulling back. The rain was falling on the western Pacific and then shifting and then returning. The system operated in complete indifference to everything living on the land masses surrounding it. Then humans built a food system that depends on predictability, and the Pacific's indifference became a threat. The 1877 event did not cause the deaths of between 30 and 60 million people because the Pacific behaved unusually. By geological standards, a super El Niño is routine. The Pacific has produced them repeatedly across history. What killed tens of millions of people in 1877 was the collision of a routine geological event with a human system that had no warning. no buffer, and a political structure that prioritized extraction over survival. That collision between an indifferent physical system and a fragile human one is not a story that ended in 1878. It is a story that continued through 1982, 1997, 2015 and 2023, and it is the story now beginning again in 2026. Each time the story repeated, humanity entered it with better tools than before, better monitoring, better forecasting, better emergency systems, better international coordination, and each time the tools reduced but did not eliminate the damage. The reduction is real and important. The gap between 1877 and 2023 is the difference between tens of millions dead and tens of millions harmed. That gap was created by a century of scientific investment, institutional building, and accumulated knowledge. The gap has not closed to zero, and in some dimensions it is being pressured from new directions. A warming planet amplifies El Niño's impacts. A more connected but also more fragile global food system means a shock in one region echoes faster into others. Communities accumulating damage from repeated climate events are entering each new event with less buffer than they had before. El Niño tells us something specific and clear about how thin the margin actually is between stability and collapse. A single pattern in a single ocean can simultaneously fail monsoons on 3 continents, flood a fourth, push global temperatures to new records, trigger wildfires across 2 hemispheres, collapse fisheries, bleach reefs, and drive disease outbreaks through populations weakened by hunger. All of that from one mechanism, one feedback loop between wind and water. The system that can do all of that in a single season is the same system that has been operating for millions of years. It is not getting stronger because of climate change, but the world it operates in is getting more sensitive to it. More people depend on rain-fed agriculture in marginal rainfall zones. More of the ocean's background heat is available to amplify events. Less time passes between major El Niño episodes for the most affected communities to recover. In May of 2026, the Pacific began warming again. The watch was issued. The probability numbers were published. The headlines ran. And in Zimbabwe, in the Philippines, in northeastern Brazil, in communities that have no word for El Niño, but know exactly what it feels like when the rain stops coming, people looked at the sky and started counting. The margin between a difficult year and a catastrophic one is smaller than most people realize, and the Pacific has never cared which side of that margin we land on. What happens next is up to us.